So we're going to do Q&A for 20 minutes.
Dr. Weiss, thank you for coming here. My name is Fabio Gonzalez. I'm a faculty member here at San Jose City College. And one of the questions I really want to ask you is, I'm pretty sure there's a number of people that have come to you and tell you, why are you preaching so much hate through your speech and everything you go around saying?
Right.
But you're not alone. There's many of us that feel the way you feel. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to ask you, from a perspective of a person of color with a higher degree in graduate and so forth, how do you continue preaching this kind of momentum and trying to develop a shift in paradigm so that folks can begin to understand that this has nothing to do with color, this has everything to do with survival of our own society?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing that keeps me doing it, of course, is contrary to those who accuse me and you and others who do this work of hate, right? It's really, and I don't mean this to sound corny at all, but it's really about really intense love, love for other people, love for the society in spite of its flaws. It's what's always ironic to me about people that accuse those of us who talk about the flaws of America as being unpatriotic or hating the country. If I hated the country, I wouldn't even waste my breath. I would just let it collapse, right? If I hated the country, I mean, in spite of my love-hate relationship with it, which I think most awake people have, I still love the potential of the country and the people of the country. And so that keeps me doing it. That keeps me energized to do it. My children keep me energized to do it because I know that the world they're going to inherit is going to be ever more dangerous even than the one that we're living in right now. And a recognition of the fact that so many people who have faced so much more than I will ever face, for sure, as a white person, have stood up and done the work. If people of color can risk everything for justice, then who am I not to do that? Who am I not to put my life on the line? Who am I not to, take whatever shit I got to take from people? Well, who am I not to get death threats or whatever the hell? I mean, that happens, but, people of color, their lives are endangered every day they walk out the door. So why would I think that I'm entitled to any greater safety than they, right? So what keeps me going is a recognition that we got a really short period of time on this planet, each of us. We could live 50 more years or 50 more minutes. And in the brief period of time that you're here, even if you live to be 100, the odds are against that, by the way, but even if you live to be 100, right, that is a blip in the history of the world that is so tiny you couldn't even physically represent it. It's meaningless in the larger scheme of things. So if you've got such a short period of time, you got to do something to justify your time here. You got to do something to justify all the oxygen that you took up, right? And all the resources that you use. Because if the only meaning of life is you just get born and you get an education, you get a job, you retire and you die, then what the hell, man? We should just all do opiates and just check out. If that's all there is, my God, sign me up for some heroin. There's got to be more to it than that, right? There's got to be something about us as human beings that compels us to do right by our communities and by our brothers and sisters and folks all across a much more complicated gender fluid spectrum than that, I should point out. And we have to be prepared to make those decisions because that's what it means to be alive, right? And so even when you get down and you get discouraged and you get cynical, you have to keep doing the work. And it may be that we do the work and nothing changes. But I do know this, if we don't do the work, nothing changes. That is certain. And so between the possibility of change and justice and the guarantee of defeat and injustice, I'm going to choose hope and do the work. Thank you for the question, though. Yes.
Thank you for continuing to speak about justice and speaking on right issues. I want to touch bases on Bill O'Reilly, who for years and years and years denied anything remotely associated with white privilege.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever were on his show or not.
Oh, no, never. No.
But as you know, he just was released by Fox News yesterday.
Yes.
Do you anticipate backlash for that?
Of course.
How could somebody who was in such a high state of denial for decades and decades have gotten the high ratings? I guess I already know the answer, but I want you to speak to that.
Right. Well, he got those ratings and he has that support because the people who love and support him are also in denial in the very same way. There's a lot of people who don't know the truth of the history of this country, and deliberately so and purposefully so. Bill O'Reilly is an interesting example of it. And you know, here's a guy, and this, keeping in mind, and I don't like to kick a person when he's down, but let's just do it. You know, because he would, or he would sexually harass a woman when she was down, I suppose. So, you know, what I'm going to do is pretty mild by comparison. Bill O'Reilly, for years, as you said, denied that there was any such thing as white privilege. And this he denied even as, I should point out, even as he grew up in a place called Levittown on Long Island. Now, I don't know if you know the history of Levittown, but Levittown was a planned community that was created by a builder, last name of Levitt, thus the name. And at the time, right, Levitt was asked if he would allow blacks to live in his planned homes. You know, there are all these sort of simple cookie cutter homes, nothing fancy, just basic starter homes. And he said, look, I can either solve the race problem or I can solve the housing problem. I choose to solve the housing problem. And what ended up happening was no person of color was allowed to live in Levittown. There was one ultimately also built in Pennsylvania, and but the first one was on Long Island. So Bill O'Reilly literally grows up in a community where black people cannot live and says he's never had white privilege. I don't know how to deal with that level of denial. I don't. How do you say you never had white privilege and you grew up in a place that only people like you could live because you were white, right? So his denial is quite profound. Other people's maybe not as profound as his, but I think there will be a backlash, I'm sure, because people dearly love Bill O'Reilly in spite of his idiocy. They dearly love the Rush Limbaughs of the world despite theirs. They used to love Glenn Beck. I guess maybe not so much anymore. There are people that sort of do fall from grace. I'm sure there will be a backlash, and Bill O'Reilly will write a new book called Killing O'Reilly, because that's what he does. He writes books about killing Lincoln, killing Patton, killing whoever, killing Jesus, and now he'll write one called Killing O'Reilly and play the victim of political correctness. But the man is a serial sexual predator, period. And we actually know this. Not only have there been a number of suits settled in that regard, there's actually recordings of him, you know, back in the day, in the earlier 2000s, you know, sexually harassing a woman on the phone, right? And talking about having sex with her with a loofah, which is that thing you use in the shower to like scrub the dead, but he couldn't remember the word loofah, so he called it a falafel. Like honest to God, like the man is a sick sexual predator. But, you know, look, the good news for Bill O'Reilly is you can be a sexual predator and you can actually go on to a job considerably higher up and more powerful than a commentator on Fox News. You can be someone who regularly sexually predates against women and ultimately become president of the United States. So I suppose we'll have to look out for Bill O'Reilly at some point in having a political career, because I guess sexually harassing and even abusing women is no disqualifier from the presidency. So there you have it. Next question, please.
So this is a comment. The Department of Health and Human Services released a statement yesterday. The Trump administration awards grants to states to combat opioid crisis.
Yeah.
So the HHS will administer grants totaling $485 million to all 50 states, basically to combat all the opiate crisis amongst the states and territories.
Right.
So I found it interesting that you were mentioning about the opiates, about people being addicted, and I read this morning, actually.
Yeah, well, hopefully that money will come through. I think it'll be interesting to see if that really happens. Of course, that money will have to be released by Congress, and so the intention of the HHS may be to make that money available to deal with the opioid crisis. That doesn't mean the money will come through. I hope it does. The second point worth making, though, is that if they succeed in repealing the ACA, and actually getting rid of the Affordable Care Act, it's going to be harder for people to get health care who have addiction problems, because part of the ACA's requirement standards of care is that things like addiction treatment have to be covered. And there are a lot of people in Congress, the president I don't think has weighed in on it so much, but on that part, but there are a lot of people in Congress who have said that they want to get rid of that. They don't want insurance companies to have to cover that. They don't want insurance companies to have to cover pregnancy even, let alone drug addiction or mental health counseling. And so the downside is, even if the HHS puts that money forward, which I hope they will do, I'm not sure that'll be a sufficient amount for it, but it's a decent start, and I hope it happens. It could be undermined on the other side by repealing or significantly altering the ACA. And of course, the opioid crisis isn't really, just like drugs in general, the drug problem of usage and addiction doesn't go away unless you deal with the root causes of what's provoking it. And in this case, it's the hopelessness that exists in an economy that was not created for the benefit of working people. And nobody in Congress who's pushing for the policies that this president talks about, nobody who's pushing for tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and doing very little to actually create jobs. They're not renegotiating NAFTA. That's completely gone now. Nobody's talking about that. They're not talking about, getting tougher on trade deals anymore. That's gone. They're not really talking about an infrastructure bill to put people back to work, because even though Trump says he wants it, the Congress certainly doesn't. Right? And so all the stuff that might actually have provided some hope to people isn't likely to come through, and that's going to mean that people are going to continue to use and become addicted. So we got to have a prevention, not just a treatment. Treatment is what you do after the fact. We got to have a prevention strategy, and you have an Attorney General of the United States who has said in his own words, we just need to get back to what Nancy Reagan said about drugs. Just say no. That didn't work, y'all. Like, if you were alive in the 80s, that did not work. So if that's going to be their strategy, dear God, 400 million or whatever it is not going to be enough to solve the problem. It would certainly be great if it happens. I just don't anticipate that it's going to be sufficient, is my fear. But anyway, thank you. Yes?
Sir, I have a question. You said that ideology that we have in the United States, that people who if he don't have something, it's his fault, not the fault of society or fault of politicals. It's maybe dangerous for people. And what do you mean? We need to get rid of this ideology. But this ideology is what make America the best country in the world. This is what make America so rich. It's what make America a country people came and they live and they want to immigrate here.
Well, I think that there's a lot of, yes, relative to the world, there's a lot of relative freedom and opportunity here. And I'm not denying that at all. That's been true for a long time. But the problem with that is, it's one thing to say that there's relative freedom and opportunity here, which is true. It's quite another to say that that freedom and opportunity is at the level we claim it to be. And I'm worried about the gap between where we are and what we ought to be, not where we are and where some other country is. I'm not interested in saying, well, people are better off here than they would be in Sri Lanka, and therefore, ... Or people are better off here than they would be in the countries that they came from, and therefore, whatever, all bets are off, and we don't have to make it any better now because it's already better than that. To me, that's a really low bar. That's a really low standard. Right? We have a constitution and we have principles that say that people are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have an equal protection clause in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, and we violate it every day. I'm interested in living up to our standards. I'm interested in living up to the standards that we have created and not taken seriously enough. So the danger is it's not about saying that the entirety of American theory and philosophy is a lie. I'm saying it is a significant myth. That's why I called it the myth of meritocracy, not the lie. Of course, there are people who go from the very bottom to the top, but it's very rare. Mobility, and I talk about this in my book, mobility is incredibly limited. The vast majority of people who were born in the bottom fifth of the income strata will stay in the bottom fifth or the bottom 2/5 of the income strata, and the vast majority of the people who are born at the top will stay in the top. And that's because intergenerational advantage gets passed down. It's not because the children of the rich are just better, it's because they're the children of the rich. And they're going to have opportunities that other people won't. Right now in this country, there are 38 people who have the same amount of wealth as the poorest half of the population of the country, which is 165 million. So you have 38 people over here, 165 million people over here. Anyone who thinks that's about merit is on drugs, is absolutely high as a kite, because there's no way that 38 people can be as smart as 165 million or as hardworking as 165 million. That's not about merit. That's about power and dynamics that keep these people in a position of power and keep these people not. On the globe as a whole, there are 52 people, I think now, who have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. 52 people and 3.5 billion. Anyone who thinks 52 people are just that much smarter or harder working than 3.5 billion, again, doesn't have any sense whatsoever. So it's not that hard work isn't a good thing. It's not that there isn't opportunity. It's that hard work is not sufficient. It has never been sufficient. Keep in mind, we said that stuff about hard work is all it takes and you can be anything you want if you just work hard. We said that during segregation. It obviously was a lie because we had a system that was intended to keep people down, and we still told them you can be anything, but not really, because we have these other policies in place. Women weren't even able to get loans from banks in their own names until the early 1970s in many places in this country. So to tell women they could have been anything was clearly a lie, right? So yes, there's opportunity, and that's wonderful, but we should be judging ourselves relative to the promises we make, not looking at other countries and saying, well, at least we're better off than we would be over there. That's just not a standard for justice or logic in my estimation. Yes?
First of all, my name is Miley Del Bono. I teach ethnic study here at San Jose City College, and I love seeing so many of our students are here. I want to thank you so much for coming to our humble college. To have someone of your statue is heartwarming. And thank you, Dr. Breland and Jason, for really pushing this event forward.
Thank you.
Now, I love your book.
Thank you.
I use it in my class. I love Douglas Blackman's book
Yeah.
on slavery by another name.
Yeah.
But this is something that I struggle with, is that both of these are white men
Yeah.
who become the leaders
Yeah.
and become the forefront person, people to speak about race.
Yeah.
If it was a person of color
Yeah.
preaching your message, criticizing white men and rich men and powerful men,
Right.
if a person of color written this book and speak about this,
Right.
would they have the same credibility? Would they have the same how they embrace you? I'd like to hear your comment on that.
Right. Well, it's a great question, and it's an important point to consider, because I think it's pretty obvious that when people of color say the same kinds of things, as they have always done for generations, they are usually routinely ignored, or they are attacked, and they are criticized, and they do not, in fact, get listened to. Now, having said that, there, of course, are many, many scholars of color who are the real leaders in this work, and in fact do write books that are used in classes and are influential. And so you can think of people like Michelle Alexander and Carol
That's
Anderson's
true.
new
That's
book,
true.
White Rage, at Emory, and you can think about Michael Eric
That's true.
Dyson and Cornell West and
Yes,
Bell
yes,
Hooks
yes,
and
yes,
others.
yes.
So there are people of color who say these things, thankfully, and lead the work, and people that I've learned from and, you know, and thankful to call friends in many cases. But absolutely, on average, right, it is certainly the case that when white folks challenge other white folks, it is far more likely to be heard than when black and brown folks challenge white folks, just like when men challenge other men around sexism. I have no doubt that there are men who can hear that more easily from another man than they can from a woman. And I think that's true with any issue. And so that's a real problem. And I want to take the opportunity, now that you've asked that question, to ask the audience to sit with it for a second and to think, you know, how would your body have felt today? Particularly for the white folks in the room, but maybe even for some folks of color, because, you know, everybody's been conditioned to take the white man more seriously. Everyone has been conditioned to do that. So ask yourself how your body may have felt differently. You don't have to answer it. I just want you to think about it. How might your body have felt differently if a person of color had been up here saying those things? Would it have been as easy to hear? Would it have been as, you know, as well received, not just in general, but by you? And before you answer, well, of course, because truth is truth, I really want you to sit with it, because we've all been conditioned to have a different reaction. When I get up and say the things I say, people can assume that it's not hateful, because after all, why would I be hating on my own group? But if a person of color does it, there's an assumption that, well, you hate white people and you're anti-white. And so I really want us to think about that, and I want all of you who came today, and I very much appreciate it, and I certainly want you to buy my books, that's why I brought them, but I want you to also buy the book White Rage by Carol Anderson, recent book, brilliant scholar at Emory. I want you to buy, Bell Hook's work. I want you to buy the works of W.E.B. Du Bois. I want you to buy the works of Marie Matsuda and Charles Lawrence. I want you to buy the books of Ron Takaki. I want you to buy the books of scholars of color who have done so much of this work and usually been ignored for it.
Thank you.
You bet. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, that was my question, but I'm just going to add on to it. And I grew up in Chicago following Obama, and when he got into office, I finally thought that us as black race was finally going to get an edge. I just thought we got him in there and we finally got revenge on the white people. And that's just a personal note.
Right.
And then we got in there, and I didn't see any movements. I didn't see any marches. I didn't see anything, as like you answered, the fighting of black and white will finally be over, but it's not over. We have to know the past. We know the past. There's a present. There's a future. What does the future look like? What picture does it have? We have young people coming up and we say, oh, just get along. Black Lives Matter.
Right.
But how do we break that machine? Everyone's been trying to break that cycle of power, and it's not going anywhere. It seems like it's not budging.
Right. Well, I think that, again, if we're going to have a silver lining in the cloud of Trumpism, it's that I think it has disabused us finally of any notion that the election of Barack Obama was going to be this revolutionary thing. And I want us to also remember, it's not just, and this isn't Barack Obama's fault. This is the fault of a system that frankly is on autopilot no matter who the president is. You understand? We have a system that is very hard to change. It's very slow to change. The founders set it up that way on purpose. The Constitution is a very conservative document in the sense of what it makes the American government look like and how it functions. So it's really hard to get things done. That said, we have a history of getting things done. And I want to tell you that even though the problem of white supremacy is with us still, as it has been all of these generations, we've learned some lessons about how to at least chip away at that. And if you ever get a chance to go, it was the most inspiring thing that I've experienced in a very long time. I went to DC in December, got a chance to go to the new Museum of African American History and Culture, which is an amazing museum. And when you walk through that museum and you see the images of enslavement and segregation, Nat Turner's Bible is on display there. Emmett Till's casket is on display there. There's a statue of Thomas Jefferson behind which are bricks with the names of the people that he enslaved. That is there. There are pictures and video of Bull Connor in Birmingham and Jim Clark, the sheriff in Selma, beating the hell out of protesters that day during the Selma to Montgomery March. And when you see those images, and yet you remember that people of color, in that particular case, black folks, but more broadly, that people of color have survived all of that. People of color, they survived Thomas Jefferson, they survived Bull Connor, they survived Jim Clark, they survived Lester Maddox, they survived the men that killed Emmett Till. They are still here. When you think about indigenous people who are still standing strong at Standing Rock and demanding their water and land rights, and you see that they are not gone, right? And they want us to know that they are not gone, then you realize that if folks of color could overcome all of that shit, right? Donald Trump is not going to be the one who actually puts the nail in that coffin. If we have beaten those folks before, we can beat them again. What it takes is determination and a willingness to lose and to lose and to lose and to lose until you win. Yes.
Hello. Hello, my name is Jackie Gamboa, and I teach in ethnic studies. One of the things that I always bring up in our classes is this question, right? Is ethnic studies for people of color? And what I've found is, of course, it has been very beneficial for students of color, but also even our white students. It's important to hear the stories, our history, from the perspective of people of color.
Right.
And so my question is, what advice do you have for students who want to continue fighting for social justice, in particular racial justice?
Well, I think the most important advice that I can give you is to start with yourself. The way we're going to build this movement, sometimes we think it's about having all the facts at your disposal and then convincing someone of the problem with a bunch of facts. But I got to tell you, I think stories and personal narrative are just as important. And the one thing we all have control over is our narrative. We have the ability to tell our stories. The reason that the way that we're going to be able to get people to turn against these ICE deportations, for instance, the way that we're going to get people to embrace the dreamers, the way that we're going to get people to embrace, black folks in the city who were under the gun, literally, from law enforcement, is people have got to start to hear the lived experience of the folks in question. It's the same thing. If you think about LGBTQ liberation as a movement, the reason that things have moved quickly in the last 15 or 20 years, thankfully, not quickly enough, but more quickly than before, is because folks got to know and realize that in their lives, in their family, in their friend circle, in their community, were plenty of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered folks that maybe they didn't know were LGBTQ, and now they do. And once you know somebody, once you have that relationship, once you hear their story, right, it becomes harder to continue to pursue inequality and injustice. So we got to start telling our stories, and we can do that with new media, we can do that with film, we can do that with podcasting, we can do that online, we can do that with social media. We can share our stories and make sure that they get out there in a number of different ways. It can be through art, it can be through music, it can be through poetry, right? And I just want people to start where they are. Sometimes we think real big picture, and we need to start where we are at, and where we're at is with our story. And when we tell our story, that's when things begin to open up, I think, for movement space. So I would start there.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, so I'm a student here at San Jose City, and I have already broken so many barriers by attending school here. But I also find a lot of millennials don't know how to start breaking more barriers when it comes to racial inequality. So how do we get started on changing the way that races are viewed among each other, and what can we do to continue fighting this?
Well, I think the answer to that is similar to the one I just offered. I think the way that we're going to break through some of the barriers, particularly the way in which people view each other and treat one another, is going to be through the sharing of personal narrative and story. And that might mean, talking about, when you talk about breaking barriers, right, talking about what that was like, what the struggles are that you've overcome to get where you are in life. And by the way, we all ought to do that. At the same time, we got to tell the truth about all the help we've had, because every one of us who's overcome any obstacle has had some help, whether that's you or whether that's me. Now, the difference is folks of color usually know they had help, right? And poor folks of all color, they generally know they had help. It's middle class and above folks, and particularly white folks, who tend to think, I did it all on my own. But actually, we've all had help. That help might have been about white privilege, it might have been about male privilege, it might have been about luck. It might have just been that mentor that we had in third grade, or that teacher that believed in us when nobody else did. So part of how we're going to break down these walls is by telling the truth about how we got from point A to point F, or wherever we're at on our trajectory, and making sure people understand that all of us had help. Because if I know that you had help, and you know that I had help, and we know that they had help, then it becomes easier to actually give help and to assist other people and to be there for them, rather than saying, well, just go get it on your own. Once you're clear that you didn't get it on your own, and I didn't get it on my own, then I don't look at you and say, well, you need to get it on your own. Then we start actually working together rather than against one another. Yes, real quick. All right, I'm being told this is it. I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
Well, you said something really profound on changing race in 2011 with Van Jones and Marisa Teresa Kumar. You were answering the question, what angers you most about the right? And you decided to answer what angers you most about the liberal left, is that we all have our little niches, and in order to fight for better healthcare, better jobs, better education, these all have to become anti-racist organizing.
Yeah.
Can you please expand on that?
Yeah, the point I was making was that, when you look at the left broadly defined, and that means anything from maybe liberal Democrats over to much more radical and revolutionary voices, most of the time, not always, most of the time, the left and progressive folks are in their little silos. So you've got the people who are working on progressive education reform, and you've got people who are working on health